currently by the MENA countries comes regarding the volatile commodity prices and the pressure that it puts on the public finances. I'm joined today by a very distinguished panel that will discuss this topic. I'm very pleased to join them today. Three of them are former ministers in Arab countries, so that I'm sure will give us a very interesting insight on the challenges that are faced in the MENA region today. Before I start, let me announce some housekeeping details. The webinar is live streamed on the YouTube channels of the ERF and the IMF, so please tune in on these if you would like. Also for Arabic speakers, there is simultaneous translation in Arabic in the webinar. You just need to press on the translation button on your bottom right. Before I start, what we're witnessing today as a generation, as economies in the MENA region, is truly unprecedented. The amount of uncertainty, the amount of economic challenges that is faced globally, and it has transcended on the MENA region, is, in my view, very unprecedented. We are projecting a global slowdown in the year to come that is accompanied with tighter financial conditions. There is ramping inflation that is driven by high fuel and food prices that has its toll on the vast majority of the poor populations of the MENA region. And this happened at the backdrop of a global pandemic that happens once in a century, along with, just to make things spicier, with the backdrop with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And it seems that all of these geopolitical health challenges put to the test the formula of social protection that has been used and relied upon for the past decades, which includes public employment and subsidies. This formula of social protection currently suffers from a very high fiscal cost and inefficient targeting, leaving a growing share of the population of the countries of the MENA region vulnerable to external shocks. And it puts the economies of these countries in a vicious circle of borrowing and indebtedness. Today's panel consists of two parts. The first part will analyze the lessons that our economies can learn from the past decades where we witnessed volatile commodity prices. And the second part will discuss the way forward. What are the policy priorities that the governments and the economies of the MENA region could adopt to increase the resilience of these economies to external shocks and to protect its vast majority of the poor people? Let me first, before I start the panel, really with great pleasure, introduce the panelists that are joining us today. First, Mr. Jihad Azour is the director of the Middle East and Central Asia Department at the IMF, where he oversees the work of the fund in the Middle East, North Africa, Central Asia, and the Caucasus. Mr. Azour has served as Lebanon finance minister during the period of 2005 and 2008. Dr. Ibrahim Elbadawi is the managing director of the Economic Research Forum since 2007 up to 2019, and where he had a spell following that as a Minister of Finance and Economic Planning in the Republic of Sudan during a period of 2019 to July 2020, and he's back now to serve DRF. Dr. Nizar Yaiche is the former Finance Minister of the Republic of Tunisia in 2020, and currently he's a partner at PwC and a member of its executive leadership team of government and public service as a global digital leader. Lastly but not least, I'm joined by fellow economist, Dr. Elina Ribakova, who has previously worked as a visiting fellow at Bruegel. Her research focused on financial markets, emerging markets, and central bank. Prior to Bruegel, she held several senior roles in economic research at a diverse set of financial institutions, most recently at Deutsche Bank in London. So I would like to welcome you all again and thank you for taking the time to talk to our attendees about really what I view a very severe set of challenges that the MENA countries are facing. And let me start first with Dr. Azour. And I'm very curious to know from you, it seems that these commodity cycles are not an innovation. It seems that we faced these commodity cycles many times in the past, not only in the MENA region, but in a lot of countries across the globe. Can you shed some light on how the typical fiscal response was used to address these past commodity cycle, and what are the lessons that we can learn from this to address the current episode?
Thank you very much, Dr. Atallah, and also I would like to thank the other members of the panel and welcome everyone. This is an important topic, as you said in your introduction, and this is why we are dedicating a chapter in our Regional Economic Outlook this year to shed light on this dimension of and the linkage between this type of shock and the fiscal response. This is clearly, as you said, not new. And usually the cycle of increase in price of fuel is combined with increase in price of other commodities and food, which makes it even more challenging to address. And usually, if we take the example of the last two episodes, you have the short-term response, which is mainly fiscal, and you expect to have a more medium to permanent response, which is to address the root cause of how these cyclicality in the price of basic needs and commodity would affect your economy and your society. In the last two episodes, when we look at the first response, we see the two main instruments that were used on the fiscal front were subsidy and increase in wages. Both of them are in fact, I would say, counterintuitive in terms of what you need usually for a temporary shock. Usually the response has to be targeted and has to be temporary. And in the case of the previous two shocks, the response was not targeted because it provided subsidy to everyone, costly, and also it tended to be more permanent, especially with the increase in wages. And all the results are showing that the impact of this kind of measure is very limited, whereby, for example, the bottom 40% of the population gets, when it comes to fuel subsidy, less than, but something between 5 and 15% of the total amount that has been used. Therefore, it's very regressive in its design. And the fact that you have the difficulty in targeting, it makes it costly and inefficient. On the other hand, over the last decade, we saw that government resorted in terms of social protection only to some of the instruments that create a permanent increase in spending, and mainly by increasing the wage bill, which in itself, in fact, led to some of the key issues that we are facing currently with the shrinking of the fiscal space that one could use in order to address any shock. Therefore, what are the lessons learned? The first lesson is for the shock that is in itself cyclical, you need to have the right instruments to address it. And the right instruments are to be targeted and create less side effects. And this is something that in the last 5 to 6 years, we saw several countries gradually addressing the problem of subsidy in the region by gradually moving from especially on the gasoline or energy subsidy from an untargeted to gradually targeted one. The second lesson is fuel and food are not the same. In a sense that the food is more, I would say, affecting the low-income group. And therefore, even when you have an untargeted subsidy system, it provides more support to the low-income people. And therefore, we need to treat the food and the fuel subsidy differently. The third lesson is information matters. And here, the weak framework in terms of understanding through household surveys who is affected by increase in price of commodities is reducing the capacity of policymakers to target their policies. 4, communication is very important. And again, here, I think it was very important lesson from COVID crisis, for example, that spending time on communicating to people what is the nature of the shock and how to address it proved to be very useful. And therefore, in the past, the level of communication or government were a bit shy in terms of communicating to their population how and why this subsidy is not the best way to address the problem, and the fact that there are other ways that are more effective and allow government to be more, I would say, able to provide support where support is needed. Last but not the least, fiscal is the short-term response to an energy shock. The medium to long-term response is some of the structural reforms. One of them is improving transportation, reducing dependence on energy for households, improving the capacity to plan for food security and increase the infrastructure for food storage, which proved to be very useful. Therefore, fiscal is a short-term, immediate response that has to become more targeted and also has to become temporary, but it should be complemented by a more structural transformation, where the type of policies would require between 3 to 5 years to yield their impact. This is how I would say the last 2 shocks provided us with lessons. What is different this time? There are some similarities and some differences. The similarities is we still respond by providing untargeted subsidy, but we are gradually moving to some targeted way of supporting. And here, thanks to the work that has been used or has been done in the last 5-6 years in improving social transfer, and also I would say the COVID provided an additional dimension of understanding how to respond in emergency situation to an exogenous shock. Therefore, yes, we are still relatively using the old methods. Gradually, we're improving new methods. And this is something that we are encouraging countries to pursue, not only all exporting countries who can afford it, but also the others, because this is with a very limited fiscal space, a very precious resource that need to be used in order to provide more inclusion and address some of the impact on the low-income groups and fragile parts of the population. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Dr. Azour. Thank you for shedding the lights on the time span of these interventions and the importance of making sure that they are more targeted and temporary. I move to Dr. Elbadawi. I apologize for the wrong name usage in the beginning. And I wanted to ask you, what are your views on the past type of intervention, and give us some insight on how costly they were in the past, and do you see that the type of targeting that was done in the past and the attempts to reform that is an indication of any improvement in the types of targeting that we are aiming for in the MENA region?
Yes, thank you very much, Amir, for this important question. And I would like to start by thanking Jihad for the report itself and his colleagues, and of course the IMF, and the succinct and informative presentation. And I fully subscribe and agree with the messages from this important report. And it's very timely for us to start thinking through about how short-term interventions are likely to impede or to promote medium to longer term resilience and sustainability. I think this is a fundamental question. And I agree with the message that the fiscal costs are tremendous, and they are already, of course, discussed in the report. And they are corroborated by other evidence. For example, the World Bank also has a recent a report in which they find that, for example, for the case of Egypt, and this is not confined only to Egypt, for almost all countries, most notably, energy importing countries, which are in dire situation compared to the energy exporting countries. They found that actually the subsidy of commodities in energy and food, are very costly, accounting for more than 2% of the GDP, or almost 2% of GDP, compared to a simulated cost associated with targeting social, in a context of social protection, the lower, decile, the lower 10% in terms of income strata. And they found that actually this will come to only 0.9% of GDP, which is 1/6 of the cost of the overall commodity subsidies on energy and food. And if we also compare with the lowest 20%, the lowest 2 deciles in terms of the income strata, this will still be very low, about 18% of GDP. And so if we compare the cost, you'll see that actually, cash transfers, direct subsidies to the lowest decile will be 1/13 of the cost of overall, the overall sweeping subsidies to commodities on energy and food. And if we even go further and provide direct support to the lowest 20% of the income strata, that will still be much lower. It comes to 1/6 of the total cost. So there is no question about it, that actually commodity subsidies, are very costly, and actually, we should say, it's not efficient and not equitable, especially energy subsidies. And in this context, if I could just very quickly, Mr. Chairman, cite my experience when I became a Minister of Finance after the revolution in Sudan in 2018, we found that the former regime, trying to entice the urban population, especially the population in Khartoum, because of their, relevance to the stability of the regime, because they can take to the street and destabilize the government, they actually subsidize energy by about 1/3 of the total budget, of the total expenditure, much more than the expenditure on education and health and social protection. So you can find such a dire situation in a country that is dominated by youth, where the below than 30 years old segment of the population account for almost 70%. Obviously, in other countries like Egypt and Tunisia and others, the situation is not that acute, it's not that extreme, but it's a variation of the theme. You have the same situation. So I fully agree with the message of the report that subsidies, overall subsidies, are costly, but we need to distinguish between, food commodities and energy. Energy is definitely very regressive and not efficient, and certainly, and is not conducive, of course, to the longer-term goals of energy transition towards renewable energy sources. So definitely, let me conclude by also highlighting the indirect cost in terms of monetary and exchange rate policy, because actually, when you are providing such subsidies in a context of very limited fiscal space, and whatever resources you generate, it has to be paid for by a very high interest rate, then you are actually complicating conditions for fiscal sustainability And even more and no less importantly, with not very much mentioned, is actually the exchange rate, because the competitiveness of the economy becomes very difficult. And that's the reason why the tradable activities in both Tunisia and Egypt, for example, are not really activated, are not really mobilized and deployed in order to create jobs for the youth, and that's a very heavy cost that I think we need also to take into account. So maybe perhaps let me stop at this stage as far as the first set of questions are concerned. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Badawi. Very interesting numbers. I took note of them, and it's mind blowing how much these subsidies are costly in terms of their, as you rightly point out, between their direct cost and indirect cost. And I find that it's the indirect cost is often neglected in comparison to the direct cost, and I really appreciate the distinguish that you pointed out between the energy subsidy and the food subsidy. I always use the example of subsidy to my students as a classical example of misallocation of resources, and you've rightly pointed these out. But also you've alluded to a very important angle that falls nicely to my next question to Dr. Yaiche. You've alluded to the usage of this subsidy to the urban population for political appeasement, and the notion that has been always there is that the reduction of this subsidy can potentially lead to political unrest. So my question is to Dr. Yaiche is you know, the commodity crisis in 1 decade ago, and it has led to political unrest, and it started a new chapter in this whole region initiated by Tunisia. So in your view, to what extent the current crisis is similar to the one in 2011, 2013 that happened on the onset of the Arab Spring? And based on that, what is, in your view, the response of policymakers in response to that to mitigate the risk of social instability, while in the same time ensuring some sort of fiscal responsibility and sustainability?
Thank you for the question. So regarding the similarity between the current crisis and the previous ones, there are some similarities, as Jihad mentioned, like for the evolution of the energy price and the food price, etc. But there are some big differences. So you can see the peaks in terms of energy indices, for example. This one is pretty similar to 2008 and pretty similar to 2011. The food one, though, was a little bit higher. And if we go a little bit deeper, we see that there are some differences. Like, for example, if you look at the wheat and we look at the rice, usually we have the same thing during the same crisis. But this time what it happened is that we have a huge peak on, for example, on the wheat, like almost 3 times higher. And we didn't have the same thing, for example, on rice. And also, one of the big differences is that we go, for example, when we analyze the beef and chicken and others, we didn't have peaks in the previous crisis, but we did have a big one on chicken. And chicken, as you know, is very important when it comes to this objective of fighting hunger with affordable protein prices. And for the first time, we see the correlation between chicken and beef. And all of this is telling us that somehow this crisis is pretty different from what we saw in the past. And this is why we should not rush to apply exactly the same solutions as for the previous one. And by the way, one more comment on the similarity is that fertilizers and the cost of fertilizers increased significantly, and it's really a big danger for a large population of this world. So the nature itself is different, and the context also is extremely different. And as you know, we are post-COVID phase, or kind of. The number of people who entered in extreme poverty increased significantly by almost 70 million in the world. So we reached 650 million. and 60% of them living in sub-Saharan countries, by the way. And we know that also the debt of many countries has doubled also in a short period of time. And this means that many of these states, especially 20 of them, they will not have enough buffer to absorb these shock waves, and most of these increases of commodity prices will pass through retail prices and therefore to inflation. So, and also the world itself, so many things happened in the past and there are so many changes, etc. So not only we have a higher risk, but we have significantly less visibility and a different crisis, and all of this is definitely leading us to be extremely careful and aware about the danger of the situation that we are seeing now. Now, to your question, how do we should respond, and from the policy making, and what's the impact of the tightening of the monetary policy? Of course, the theory says that by tightening the monetary policy, via increasing the interest rate, of course, the prices of the commodity prices globally will go down, of course, through different channels, by appreciating the domestic currency. So therefore, of course, you reduce by pushing some speculators to shift out from commodity contracts to into treasury bills and others. And there are also other ways. But let's admit that all of this is somehow treating the symptoms and not the root cause. The root cause is a shock on supply side on some selected products, which was contagious to others, but not to all. And this is not an excess of consumption. And also we need to admit that for certain low and medium income countries, that if we reduce because the dollar went up versus their local currency rates, so this didn't really solve the problem for them, because of course they compared to their national currencies. Also, what was used is the increase of interest rates on national monetary policies, and this is of course to release pressure on the demand side and pushing somehow and delaying some of the purchases, like the cars and houses, etc., for certain categories of people, and also pushing upward somehow the offers for the savings, and the savings proposals will be up, and some people will be tempted to save more. All of this, of course, is happening in theory. However, what is happening in reality in many low and medium income countries, especially when the number of vulnerable people and the population of low and medium income is pretty high, is that these people will not be impacted by such measure, by increasing the interest rate. And also the very rich people will not be impacted because by definition, the elasticity of these very rich people is extremely low. So we are somehow trying to address the third segment, which is medium to high income people, to force them to reduce, whereas the impact on low and medium income people and most vulnerable might have a negative impact. And let me also remind that in the current situation with a big crisis, so this population, they need to pay the food more expensive. They need to pay their loans and mortgages more expensive. And also, if they still have, when they operate within fixed budgets and limited budgets, when the loans goes up, this means that you are impacting the rest. They operate within fixed budget. And this is the worst thing and the very last thing you want to do during crisis times. This is why I'm not saying that this is not wrong all over the places, etc. But we need to be extremely careful to analyze what's happening for the inflation, not to see it as a plunder, and to analyze carefully these conflicting messages so that we use the proper tools. And one more message here linked to that is that when big countries and I'm using, for example, using the most used currencies, when they tighten their monetary policy, there is an impact on low and medium size economies and emerging countries, and especially oil importing countries. How, of course, by increasing their interest rate, definitely the principal and their interest will increase. And also by tightening their monetary policy, they are favoring the foreign exchange rates. So the dollar and the euro and the yen, etc., will increase, relatively speaking, to the local currencies. And this has a double effect on these countries, and it is significant. And we just finished a study just recently with some experts. We did the example for Tunisia, for example, on some publicly available data, by the way, and we complemented with some analysis. And so we saw the impact of these monetary policies on these countries, and a country like Tunisia, and the impact, of course, on the variable interest rates, etc., and seeing the impact, etc. And the impact is really significant. And the impact is approximately what's happened this year is approximately about 5.8% of the budget of this year. That's policy. That's a huge. That's in addition, of course, to the other impact of the commodity prices, which is roughly about 8% or even more. And total together, that's more than 6 or 7% of the GDP. So that's a big part of the wealth being created in that small and wonderful country full of beauty, etc. Some of them is, of course, caused by the war in Ukraine, right? But the inflation, let me remind you that it started before the war in Ukraine, but it's mainly the war. This war, which is, for me, of course, it's a lose-lose war between parties, but it's not only between parties, it's a lose-lose war, destroying a lot of value on all these aspects, and that's pretty too much for a wonderful country like Tunisia trying to build its own democracy, etc. And what I'm saying here, valid for Tunisia, is also valid for many other countries. And this is why my message here is really to understand, to try and understand what's happening there. I'm not saying that the central banks are doing the wrong things; they are doing probably the right things. And but the idea is to measure these indirect impacts on other countries, and then imagine some tools and some new instruments to somehow correct the system. And I think this is a good way also to remove some of the biases that we have. So with these embedded costs, we are biasing some of our models, some of our thinking, and therefore potentially we are changing some of our conclusions that might be partially wrong.
Thank you, Nizar Yaiche, for really dissecting the implications of monetary policy tightening globally on our economies, and really showcasing the very severe implications on the economies of the MENA region, and it's really insightful that that policymakers should be aware that this is a shock on the supply side, and based on that, they should design their policy accordingly. Let me move to Dr. Bakova and zoom out of the MENA region. And look at other emerging markets. Again, this is not a novel crisis. And it's not new to the globe. What kind of lessons can we draw from the experience of emerging markets that sought to impact the impact of volatile high food prices and energy prices? And in what aspects can we learn from these in the MENA region?
Thank you so much, Samer. And it's very hard to follow in the footsteps of Nizar, Ibrahim, and Jihad, who have spelled out this extremely well. So I will indeed broaden it out to other emerging markets and also developed markets. We shouldn't, we used to think that emerging markets and developed markets somehow are separate and developed markets know better. I think we need to highlight some examples of mismanagement that are already happening also in Europe and the UK and others. So just very first point I want to make is on coordination of the central bank and the Ministry of Finance. And Ibrahim and Nizar made that point, but I want to emphasize it more. What we hear a lot in Europe, for example, is when you have the packages from the Ministry of Finance, which are anti-inflationary, and the central bank doing something for the spreads of the government, you know that you need to worry. Usually it should be the other way around. The Ministry of Finance should focus on subsidies that are targeted, while the central bank should be focused on inflation. And I think this is sort of the predicament that we have put ourselves in many countries, including in Europe, for political reasons. It's extremely hard with the size of the shock to follow the dogma and say, look, I'm only going to subsidize the particularly vulnerable parts of the population. However, if we build the blanket packages that are covering the whole of population, like we have seen in many countries in Europe, is that we're preventing adjustment from happening. You know, there are higher income individuals which should reduce their consumption voluntarily when the prices are high. And then also we're setting up ourselves potentially for trouble for medium term. If we're saying that this year, maybe the package is effective, so we managed to bring down inflation via fiscal packages, but when we think about it, it might be a medium-term problem, and I'll talk about it as well in terms of the war with Russia. We talked about the fertilizers, you know, we're talking about the food price now, but the fertilizers affect not just the crops this year and next year, they will feed into the meat prices as well. And as we know, that is a multi-year project for sure, right? So then we might be able to reduce with the special packages inflation this year. But that means for next year, what? We're going to do another 2%, 4% of GDP package, or we will also have to fight the base effects that we have created this year. So I think it's very dangerous when, for political reasons, we're trying to market this fiscal packages that are blanket packages, and also that we will not be able to sustain multi-year, because it brings us to the fiscal policy with this anti-fragmentation tool we see in Europe, but also in many other countries. Now, going a little bit on the fiscal monetary policy coordination in emerging markets, we have to say that many key large emerging markets have started hiking rates well in advance. So when this extra commodity price shock came, they were better prepared. However, I'm hard-pressed to find an emerging market, and many of them are commodity exporters, which are not expanding fiscal policy next year relative to the budgets that they plan to in 2019, and also for many relative to the budgets that they have now. So what that means for many emerging markets in particular is that the monetary policy will have to do extra tightening. So it will end up having one hand gives and another hand gives away. And the market is very forceful on emerging markets, but not only. And that brings me to the point of the fiscal monetary coordination, but also financial stability. As we have seen in the example of the UK, which market actually went after them, and that was clearly the end of this, MMT conversation, you know, which we in emerging markets know very well. You know, you print money, it's never free. Somehow developed markets needed to find it on their own. So it sort of definitely brings then to that conversation. So the market discipline of central bank versus the treasury came very swift, but it also brings us to the point of financial stability. It is maybe sort of not as pronounced in many emerging markets because our financial sector institutions are less complex, but still we have leverage. We have banks that rely on the global financial markets. We have banks that rely on borrowing, the old-fashioned loan to GDP, to deposit ratios that we need to look at. And the UK is a clear example. When you have monetary policy that needs to tighten because fiscal maybe is overdoing it, then you will have financial sector stability concerns, and you will not always be able to deal with them with just macroprudential measures. So I think that's an important part of this coordination package. The last point I want to make is on the sort of the war and the medium-term outlook. We should not forget that if you look at the share of conflicts globally, armed conflicts by region, they have increased sharply in recent years. It's not just Ukraine. And of course, conflicts globally lead to food instability. And we talk a lot about sanctions and Russia-Ukraine war in Europe and the US, but it's a very wrong sort of centric Europe and sort of the West-centric perception of the world. And I'm very happy that this seminar is happening, because the food insecurity is a massive concern, and it's starvation concern in many countries. And when we talk about sanctions, economic statecraft, we're talking about Europe freezing. We oftentimes forget about the big chunk of the world that is starving and has been starving because of this increase in armed conflicts that has the spillover to the food insecurity. And we also should not forget that the Russian groups like Wagner Group, which is a private arms sort of military, paramilitary units of the Russian government. Well, it's a private group, but it's sort of directed by Russian government. It has been involved in conflicts like Mali, Sudan, Mozambique, even potentially Armenia, Belarus, Ukraine, Syria, Libya, Venezuela. So it's not that Russia is participating in just one military conflict. It's also participating in the conflicts across the world. And that is also then driving up the food insecurity. That's very important. And thank you so much for organizing the seminar, because we need to shift the center of the discussion away from just US and Europe, but more globally. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. This is very obviously timely, because I mean, as you rightly noted, this is not just the emerging market. It seems also that developed countries need to attend this seminar, and it seems that the coordination between fiscal and monetary policy is not an issue of this part of the world, but it seems it goes all the way to the UK. And I really appreciate your terminology of blanket packages. And I think obviously the issue of targeting is not an issue that is only of problematic nature in the MENA countries, but it's also problematic politically in developed countries. So with that, we've kind of moved to the second part of today's webinar, and just I want to bring to the attention of our attendees that there is a Q&A button on the webinar, and where they can post their questions. And if we have time after the second part of the webinar, we may entertain some questions to our distinguished panelists. The next part of today's panel is the way forward, is what is the kind of recipe for policies to mitigate this highly volatile, highly risky environment that the region is going through. And I'll start with Dr. Azour first. And so, given all what you have discussed in your introductory remarks about the past, and given the limited fiscal space that the countries of the region are operating in, and given that there were initial steps that were taken vis-a-vis energy reform in some countries of the MENA region, what do you think, if we focus on the energy, what do you think is still needed for progress when it comes to price subsidies, energy subsidies, and how can it be sequenced, and how can it be introduced in this very highly volatile environment that we are going through now?
Thank you very much, Samer. 2 points for introduction. One has to recognize that countries have already started to address the issue of subsidy. The work has started, but it's still an unfinished business. And I will go in more details what is still to be done. And the second, this is something that has to be country specific. Ultimately, what is the real question? The real question is how to allow market to clear prices without affecting it, and therefore addressing the side effect of that through other policies. Therefore, the real name of the game is the policy trade-off. And here, there are two dimensions. One is how to reduce the dependence, and the second dimension is how to mitigate what you cannot reduce in terms of dependence. And this brings certain number of other related questions. Reducing the dependence is something that all countries need to do, and need to, at the high oil price or low oil price, this is something that is needed, because this will improve your ability to design your policies. Also, you reduce the risk of any volatility and any shock on your economy, not only on the fiscal, but as we saw also on your external account monetary policy, but also reduce the impact of that on your carbon emissions, because this is also something that the subsidy is, especially the fuel subsidy, is promoting additional, I would say, climate issues. Therefore, the policy trade-offs here is very important, but should not prevent or preclude from addressing the issue of reducing dependence. When it comes to the trade-off, there is one dimension, which is mitigation. The best way to mitigate is through a well-established social safety net. By having the right mechanisms, the automatic stabilizers, and use this as a conduit in order to provide support to those who need it. Of course, countries are at a different stage in terms of their social protection framework, and therefore there are needs to complement that. And this is where the targeting approach is important. And this is something that should gradually allow us to move into something that the region needs, a real social protection framework. We did recently a study on social protection and social protection spending, where we discovered that what the region is spending on social protection is less than, for example, what the region is transferring for the fiscal deficit of SOEs. Therefore, and here also, again, we're back to the policy trade-offs. You need to address certain issues that will provide you with additional fiscal space that you will use to target better, to improve your social protection, while you are reforming the overall social framework. You need also to improve your capacity to make decisions. I mentioned earlier the lack of data through household surveys, the lack of information on who is consuming and what is the impact of increasing prices in terms of elasticity is something that is technical, but it's very important for you in designing the policies. And also, you need to change the way you price. Here we're going maybe into technicalities, but sometimes the way you price energy, the formula of pricing could in fact have an impact on the subsidy itself. Therefore, it's very important also to address those technical issues. Therefore, policy trade-offs are important. Developing the infrastructure for making decisions is very important. And again, I want to point to what the recent episode with COVID has provided us with a wealth of instruments on how to have a matrix of policies to address a shock like that. I fully agree what has been said. You need also to reconcile the fiscal action with other economic policies, especially in a period where inflation is high. The most important objective at this stage is to limit inflation, because inflation is the most unfair type of taxation. Therefore, the priority has to be reducing inflation, and therefore fiscal policy or subsidy policy should not unwind or reduce the impact of the monetary policy. Therefore, it's still very important to address the issue of inflation, especially in the region where the inflation has reached double digit in most of the countries. It's very important also to, while addressing the issue of subsidy, take into consideration that there are certain transitory measures that are needed, and here mainly for the productive sector, and therefore in certain cases you could provide some exceptions for the productive sector, especially the small and medium-sized companies. But again, I think here, reducing dependence, accepting that you have trade-offs, putting in context the very limited fiscal space. If you take the example of Tunisia, what Tunisia is spending on energy subsidy exceeds 4% of GDP. This is bigger for a country like Lebanon. And those countries have limited fiscal space, or I would say very, very tight fiscal space. Therefore, it's very important also, and I will conclude with that, to explain those trade-offs to the population and to showcase how this type of measure that maybe for the general population is the easiest way, or they consider that this is something that they are entitled to, is something that is very costly, not providing the right results and creating a lot of side effects. And this is something that also we need to put it in a context, because including oil exporting countries, it's important also to address this issue, although those countries are, with the increase in oil price, increasing their reserves. But it's still something that is needed, including for those who I would say are benefiting from in a high oil price.
Thank you, Dr. Azour. This is a I want to reiterate 2 points that I think are very important among what you said. I think, in my view, the notion that the approach should be country-specific is very important and should be clearly underlined. There is no one size fits all, and it's very important. And another point that I think is important, not to diminish the importance of other points that you mentioned, but as an academic, I really want to highlight and underline the importance of linking data and information to targeting. I think this is, in my view, a point of deficiency in the economies of the MENA region, even though I acknowledge there has been considerable progress when it comes to availability of data. Let me move back to Dr. Elbadawi. And in your earlier remarks, Dr. Badawi, you made clear distinction between the food and energy subsidies. And I think it's a very important distinction to be made in our design of policy, given the current volatility that we're witnessing. And again, wearing your hat as a previous minister of the Republic of Sudan, to how should this process of differentiating food subsidy and energy subsidies should and how should be differentiated, and to what degree we should maintain these food subsidies as part of a policy framework?
Yes, this is an important, obviously, policy question and research question as well. Let me start, as you asked, from my experience in Sudan. For example, it turns out that because Sudan borders 4 countries that are landlocked, the huge subsidy by a poor country that was and continues to be in a dire kind of crisis, economic and political crisis, have actually led to very active smuggling of subsidized commodities. So much so that the Chamber of Transport business community or business association, they did a study, and they found actually, because of these smuggling activities that created scarcity in subsidized petroleum products, the actual cost is actually higher than the international prices then back in 2019. And so actually I fully agree and subscribe to Jihad's emphasis on the importance of studies and data and knowledge-based kind of economic narrative at all levels, by the government, by civil society, professional association, actually about, and also the role of what some recent literature suggests, the evaluative state, a state that collects data, share data, analyze data, and make sure that actually this data is translated into a knowledge-based narrative about what works and what does not work. And I think this is very important because there are considerable misconception about the effectiveness of subsidies, especially petroleum subsidies. And this is the view harbored by the urban-based middle class, who thinks that actually the governments in the region are not providing us with public goods that are acceptable to our standard in education and health. So the least they could do for us is to subsidize, energy, because we send our children to private school and we pay for that. We pay taxes, and also we go to private hospitals. This is, by the way, a narrative that pervades the entire region, from all the way from Morocco to Egypt and down to Sudan and north to Lebanon and Jordan. So I think it is very important actually to inform the public about the limit subsidies, and that actually subsidies are not good for the middle class. That actually improving social services in education and health, and bring them to the standard will be much better for the middle class. As for the food, this is definitely very important, especially since we know that in many of our societies, there are a large segment of the population bunched around the poverty line. There is a significant portion of the lower middle class who are actually just very close to the poverty line. So any type of shock like the one that we are experiencing now are bound to bring people below the poverty line. And that's why food subsidies are very important. But even then, there are studies that actually the consumption dominance study for the Economic Research Forum in collaboration with the Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia, ESCWA. Actually, we did a study on the impact of food subsidy from the perspective of poverty. And they found that, for example, for the case of Egypt, subsidizing certain commodities actually protects the poor much better than others. So studies, again, can actually be very helpful in terms of rationalizing and guiding food subsidies. Certainly, food subsidies should be temporary, especially when the shock is over. And during the interim period, I think it is very important to complete the national registry and the importance of mobile cash transfers and using mobile accounts as an instrument to actually enhance and mainstream and broaden cash transfers. I remember we had a conversation in one of the webinars about the role of cash transfers in Kenya and how actually Kenya has excelled in terms of the mainstreaming cash transfers through mobile money that actually created big data. And there are 3 companies in Nairobi now selling actually information and analysis about SMEs and actually are contributing to financial inclusion. So this is digital transformation, and using mobile money, I think is very important in this interim period in order to pave the way for enhanced cash transfers and targeted cash transfers. In the case of Sudan, the plan that, of course, was disrupted by political instability and the situation that emerged after and disrupted the political transition, is that we targeted, we basically used the electricity bills, and we plan to cut off the top 20%. And provide cash transfers to the lower 80%, because poverty in Sudan was very high, estimated as in the high 60s. So we thought that this would be much better because we need time so that we can build the infrastructure, the informational infrastructure, institutional infrastructure to do precise targeting. And the immediate initial reaction to the cash transfers had been quite significant. And I think kind of economic national narrative to promote the idea that the family is the best unit in society in actually deciding and determining its interest. And again, I would say that the studies collected by the British ODI, Overseas Development Institute, using more than 60 programs of cash transfers, they found that actually families do effectively, make use of the money, and that actually it is not in lieu of demand for labor. It's actually have had considerable impact on food and nutrition, the school attendance, the cutting labor, child labor, and so on and so forth. So I think in our region, we need really an awareness campaign about the importance of transiting from, for example, the promotion that we use as a minister, or we use in the government then, was we are not lifting subsidies, we are transiting or graduating from subsidizing commodities to directly empowering people in Sudan. And it's important actually to promote this kind of narrative and to back it up with knowledge and data, based, credible narrative. And I think this is very important because actually what is now impacting the region poses a threat to social cohesion. And so it's very important for the government and civil society to explain to the public, the plans that they have in the short run and the long run, and why they want to transit from subsidies to, or at least target subsidies to only food, and that eventually the plan should be to try to move into a more transparent and broad-based cash transfers in the future. So I think more or less this would be my take on this set of questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Elbadawi. This is I'm glad that you have highlighted how important they are in terms of food subsidies, and you also I think you've echoed what Dr. Azour said in his opening remarks about the importance of a clear communication plan to the public in order to understand the basic trade-offs or the policy trade-offs that are facing our nations in the MENA region. I want to move to Dr. Yaiche and ask a more technical question, if I may, Dr. Yaiche. Is there a set of financial instruments, given that this is not the first time this is a repeated, one of many repeated episodes of commodity shocks? Is there some sort of financial instruments that allow countries to hedge against this, and in terms of the short-term hedging, such as long-term contracts or some sort of stabilization funds? And to what extent can these be applicable to the countries in the MENA? And just to add to that, what is the role of the international financial institution in some sort of this kind of framework?
Yes, sure. There are so many products, hedging production, that clearly should be part of the competencies within each state and within each administration. And risk management should be clearly embedded within each national strategy. And this is why it's important that this kind of competencies should be developed within administration. And this approach should not only applicable to one ministry. This should be involve different ministries. This should not be only the responsibility, for example, of the Ministry of Finance. Experts from other ministries like energy, commerce, etc., agriculture should be involved. And I know this kind of approach, which is pretty transversal and not silos, it's pretty complicated in many countries, unfortunately, but this should be clearly there. Now, the reality, what's happening is that from the political angle, and to be honest, is such tools, usually they are costly. So if you are a decision maker and you're a politician and you want to buy some of these, actually what's happening is that when you buy them and then you use them later on, that's normal. And when you buy them and that you don't use them, it fires back because that's a waste of money. And that's one of the issues. And this is why also we need to introduce more than policies, etc., and strategies. We need to put the proper framework so that technicians and experts have a bigger role in the decision-making process, especially in the era that we are entering now, this high-risk era. Now, to your question about the policy making and the future and how we should integrate all of this, for me, the trade-offs of policies, as Jihad mentioned, it's very important. And there are, of course, much more than two pillars. Usually, we tend to focus on two dimensions. So the social instability or stability and also the fiscal sustainability. So these are two important dimensions, but in reality, the trade-off and the road is extremely thin, and we should take into account 5 dimensions at least, and not 2. There is, of course, the social dimension, the safety nets, how we target better the compensation, etc., but how we address these compensation at the right moment. And as you know, crisis times are not the best timing to introduce and to change from compensation system, unfortunately. So social stability is very important, but also the fiscal stability, clearly, the fiscal flexibility, and the fiscal discipline. So this is a second dimension. And what we are seeing is sometimes we tend to borrow for 20, 30 years to consume products that will be consumed this year. And that's the problem, and we go for easy solutions, unfortunately. The third dimension that we need to integrate in these trade-offs, of course, is the monetary and financial stability. And this should include, and not limited to the foreign exchange evolution, of course, but also to the central bank's reserves. The fourth dimension, key and fundamental, and which represents for me the future of these population, is the economical growth. And we should not hinder this dimension, very important dimension. And unfortunately, this is what is happening in most of the cases, meaning that we reduce the capital expenditure budgets because we cannot afford it during crisis times. The fifth one, but it's not the less important one, is the political capital and the political engagement. And this should be clearly another important dimension, because in terms of governance, those who are supposed to lead all of this, they need to select well the right battles so that they can engage with them. So that's happening. Unfortunately, we see so many mistakes happening in this dimension during crisis times. I mean, going for easy solutions, focusing only on short term, not focusing enough on structural reforms, going for populism, going for extremes, etc. And unfortunately, all of this has a big impact on the macroeconomical balances and also on the fiscal stability. So these, for me, these 5 dimensions should be clearly part of each strategy while we build it. In addition, to understand clearly and to have a bigger picture of what's happening in the world. Of course, today's topic is mainly about the current crisis and about the related risks, etc. But it's also very important to see the bigger picture on what's happening while building these big policies. What's happening, because this crisis sooner or later, probably after 6 months or a year or whatever, it will go away and probably will go back to kind of a new normal. But it's important to have in mind what's happening elsewhere, and there are some big trends. And there are some other big challenges that we didn't talk about today, and that we should be clear about. The first one is, of course, and the most obvious, is the climate change, and that's a big element. And as you know, by 2030, almost half of the population, of the world's population, will be living under a big water stress. And also there will be so many big and very large cities. By 2030, we will have a big risk of water increasing, like Amsterdam and like Venice and like New Orleans and many other Asian and African cities. So this is a very big, and there are so many big challenges behind it. The second thing that we need to be aware of while building these policies is also all these the technology changes. So the arrival of the metaverse, of the blockchain, of the artificial intelligence, and all these new capabilities, but also at the same time, so many big challenges on cybersecurity, on labor, on mental health, on misinformation, on disinformation, on so many other topics, on the fact that the regulation is lagging behind, and that most of the institutions are behind in terms of regulation. The third big also element that we need to be aware of is the demographic changes, and there are so many big ones. And within by 2050, the median age of many big countries will be above 50, and some of them will be close to 60 years of age, the median age. And we are talking about big countries like South Korea, like Japan, like Italy, like Germany, and so many others. And the age population dependency ratio will increase significantly from to higher than 50, and in some cases closer to 75%. And at the same time, we see countries like Nigeria, etc., with a median age slightly higher than 20 years old. And in some countries, we'll have 2.5 billion people who are entering into the workforce, and we need to give them food, and to give them jobs, and to give them security, and to give them health solutions, etc., etc. So there are some very, very big resources mismatch. The other element, also the fourth one, is the financial system. And as we can all see that we are reaching a kind of limit of this financial system, and there are many biases, and we need to correct so many things in the big thinking of the financial system. There are so many intangibles, there are so many hidden structures and flows, there are a big proportion of it is being taken by pure speculation without value creation, etc. The other element is the social instability that we addressed today, and definitely there are some also very big risks there. And on the top of this, and as Elina mentioned, is the different tensions that we are seeing in the world, and this fracturating world, and this multi-nodal world with a big pressure on regulation, big pressure on boycotts, and these kind of things, and creating and differences in regulation, creating yet other challenges and risks. All of this is to say that it's very important collectively to address these issues in a new way, in an innovative way, in a collaborative way, all together, to sit together around the same table, and really to be aware of the danger and the big challenges that the world is facing, and to come up with innovative solutions. Really, we need innovative solutions to address all these issues, and etc. Especially that we have 20 countries at very high stress level, and we are talking about hundreds of millions of people. And we said also that we have 70 million people entering into extreme poverty in only a couple of years. So these numbers are very big. And at the same time, there are 3.5 billion people who will be arriving in the upcoming 30 years in certain geographies where, if we don't change the trend, we have prepared very tough conditions for them. So we have somehow planned suffering, unfortunately, for 3.5 billion people who are yet to come in the upcoming 30 years. And this is why I think it's important to come up with an innovative solution. I saw that there are some new instruments being proposed by certain institutions, also like by the IMF, etc., linked to the climate. And the idea is to come up with a new instruments to correct this, and to adjust this, and to anticipate some of these challenges. And I think to conclude about this point, I think there are 4 main areas, if I may suggest, where we should focus on with some kind of guidelines, and I think it will bring a lot of added value if we do them. The first topic is clearly due to the urgency of what's happening today in the world, and due to the surge of commodity price, is really to come up with an instrument whereby vulnerable people can buy food in a much lower price now, at scale. And this is very important. So supporting the countries with very high stress level, and upscale the aid. And this should not lead to yet another more debt. And we need to find the right instrument there, and we need to act quickly. And that's one. The second one is about the risk. And if we would like really to change the situation, we need to create new instruments, like the ones that we mentioned, the hedging, etc. But the problem is that for these ones, hedging is that during crisis times, they do not work. And my own experience, they have a limited efficiency. Why? Because we are relying on markets, and we are relying on individuals and financial institutions who are there to make money, and we want them to make money. But when the risk is high, and the volatility is high, and visibility is extremely limited, the prices cannot be suitable. And I faced this issue, and I couldn't find good products with good contractual terms during crisis times. And this is why we need financial institutions, etc., to come up with an instrument whereby we can secure the states. The main purpose is not to make money now; it's really to save, to limit the risk. The management costs should be kept to the minimum. The revenues part should not be in percentage-wise, but reflecting the cost. And why not paying back the revenues once there is no risk, And of course, the pricing should be in a suitable way. The third one, which is for me, it could be a game changer. It's a game changer if we do it, and if we come up with a good instrument, which is how we direct the private equity money and flow to low and medium and emerging economies. In a period where we have scarce public funds, and in a period where we have big opportunities in these countries, at the same time we have very high risk, the equation is how to direct private equity money there with new instruments. And the solution can only be, for me, by sharing together the risk, meaning the private investor, the states, the concerned states, and the multinational banks and the international financial institution, with a fair distribution of risk. If we come up with such innovative tools, like we did, and we are what you are planning to do now for the climate, I think it can be really a game changer. If we want to save these countries like 10, 15, 20 years down the road, it comes with the development of their GDP, it comes with the wealth creation in a world where we have higher risk and limited public funds available. The solution for me is working on the risk side for the private. The last element, and I will stop there, is changing and correcting the system. And what's happening in the system now, and all these embedded costs. I took as an example earlier today, this embedded cost of tightening of monetary policies done by some policymakers abroad, and it's impacting countries like ours, and has tremendous costs. These are embedded costs. These are hidden costs. It's, for me, similar to the cost that we had for the climate. For years and years and years, we were producing, we were hiding the costs and the damage that we are doing to the climate. And now we introduce the carbon cost, which is a wonderful tool, which is very well adopted and accepted. It's what is it doing? It's somehow revealing the real cost of doing things by putting a cost to the carbon. And ideally, if we can remove all these hidden costs, we can introduce not the carbon cost, but the inequality cost, or something that we can call similar, probably we can move all these biases in our thinking, and probably we'll come up with a better solution to the world and to our children.
Thank you, Dr. Yaiche. It's a very detailed and rich intervention. I cannot really summarize it. It contains a lot of a broader perspective that goes beyond the current crisis and entails quite very rigorous approach to the challenges that are facing the region and globally. I want to move back to Dr. Bakova, and again, along the same lines, the question I asked Dr. Yaiche, the recurrence of these crises globally, not just on our region, but also globally, puts to the test the current policy frameworks to the test, and to what extent they are resilient to these. And Dr. Yaiche have alluded to that. But in your view, what are the key policy interventions? What are the key fixes that needs to be injected, so in order to improve the existing policy framework? In your earlier intervention, you alluded to the separation between monetary policy and fiscal policy, but can you elaborate more on this point and beyond? Thank you.
Thank you so much, and it's a pleasure again to be back here with the Fiscal Affairs, also department where we worked a long time ago on the sustainability in the commodity exporting countries with my colleagues. So I think the rule book hasn't changed, although I have the utmost respect for the integrated policy framework by the IMF, which acknowledges some of the challenges of emerging and frontier markets. Nonetheless, the standard prescriptions, I think, still stay the same. And as you mentioned, coordination within the fiscal and monetary policy is very important. So on the central bank side, and I'm sorry for the appearance here, on the central bank side, we do have to help countries to move towards more flexible exchange rate regimes, but in a sensible way. And this, what does it mean for each country is different. However, it does not mean multiple exchange rate regimes. and I'm not going to name any specific countries here, but it is oftentimes a vehicle for corruption rather than for anything else. However, it's very understandable, as also Nizar was mentioning, reliance on the short-term capital flows is very dangerous. Opening your capital account before you have fiscal house in order is also very dangerous. Fully giving up your natural resources to foreign investors is also maybe unproductive, and we should have some rule that keeps some of the domestic participation versus the foreign participation and has a fair share of money from the natural resources going to the country. However, aiming towards flexibility on the exchange rate regime, more predictable inflation targeting, consolidating this multiple exchange rate regimes, I think is very important. Maybe in the early days saying that, look, we do not want to have short-term capital flows. We just want to focus on attraction of their foreign direct investment with fair profit sharing of our companies. That is fine. So you do the gradual opening up of the capital account. Or maybe we welcome some of the short-term capital flows, but in a transparent way, not in some hidden account, again, non-countries to be named, but we put aside the monies in the reserve accumulation proportionate to short-term capital flows that are coming in. So therefore, when the risk of an outflow, we have this money that we can spend to protect our exchange rate from excessive fluctuation. So I think this is definitely key. On the Ministry of Finance side, and again, here the IMF has done, the MCD department and others have done fantastic work in terms of the fiscal policy rule. We have seen the early days of the fiscal policy rules in Chile, a lot of research done on that, then many other countries of having, there's a lot of discussion of how to set the specific price that needs to happen. But sometimes one could even say, let's take an average price of 100, yes, we wish, maybe 10 years, 20 years. In some cases, there is an expert committee. But what's more important, there is a price. We can make a mistake on that price, but there is a fiscal policy rule over and above. In a transparent way, there is accumulation of monies into account that gets reported. We have seen in many countries some sort of a fiscal rule, but we never know where that account is. Is it with the commercial banks? Is it part of the reserves? Do we have regular reporting on that account? And I think it's very important that it stays with the central bank as the, sort of like a version of the single treasury account that is transparent, that the citizens of the country can follow and track. And I think it's a very important disciplining device. I think it's also the metrics, and again, the IMF has been very good at stressing that. We often talk about the debt to GDP ratio. But in many commodity exporting countries, we need to focus on non-oil revenues as a percentage of GDP. Maybe debt to GDP ratio is small, but if you look at the non-oil revenues of maybe only 5 or 6% of GDP, that is extremely low. And it's sort of a debt to GDP ratio, and sustainability is misleading, is a misleading indicator of a sustainability. It's not oil revenues to GDP, and also the cost of funding, which also Nizar just talked about, relative to GDP is very important. And then finally, just to go back to what my other colleagues said, the SOEs not only drain resources from their budget, but also they drain resources from the whole economy. And then also removes your ability to collect non-oil revenues to GDP. And a good example of mismanagement is, for example, South Africa, where even coming out of the COVID experience, we still have slow economy, but Eskom is still not capable of delivering the needed electricity production to sustain even this very low level of GDP. And of course, that's an extreme example of the negative feedback loop between the mismanaged SOE and then affecting the whole of the economy. So not only the direct spending, which Jihad, of course, highlighted so well, but also the indirect effects of the SOE's inefficiencies in different parts of the economy. So this is the wishful thinking, the list the IMF has been very consistent on. It's fantastic the IMF has moved on to understanding better the political realities in each individual countries, but I think the objectives still should stay the same, that we're wishing for the first best, we understand it takes us time, and in the meantime, we try to adapt to each individual country how the best to get there.
Thank you so much. I think that you've laid down a very, very interesting menu of things that should be done on the long term, regardless of crisis or not. And I want to echo what Dr. Yaiche said, that crisis time is usually not the best time for any policy changes or major structural changes in the policy framework. So I guess the takeaway point from your intervention is that there is homework to be done, regardless there is a crisis or not, and these are pretty much important things to do. We are running out of time, but I just want to highlight that I want to thank the American University in Cairo, my institution, and the Economic Research Forum, and the International Monetary Fund, your exceptional intervention and your distinguished participation in this has led to over 100 participants and attendees in this webinar. So I want to thank you for your time. In the very last seconds remaining, there was a question about climate change, and is this crisis an important venue to address more sustainable and climate smart investment for the countries in the MENA region? So if I can ask quickly my distinguished panelists here to just in a few seconds address that, and I'll start with Jihad.
Thank you very much. This is effectively an important issue. I think COP27 showed us that climate transition and climate mitigation are still the two main priorities. There is one issue that I would say came into the discussion is energy security. That with the war in Ukraine and the impact on commodity prices, it was brought back in the center stage of discussion. The other dimension that also I think it's important to also look at is financing climate transition. And this is something that the fund has been actively working on. We did the bold move by developing a resiliency and sustainability trust that effectively is a long-term instrument to help countries succeed in those kind of long-term strategic transformations, while recognizing that the role of the fund should be a catalytic role, should be in fact creating the right framework and allowing others to come in. But this is definitely something that we collectively, we need to focus on, both institutional, public, as well as also private money, recognizing that this is a long-term, that should go hand in hand with addressing the issues of maintaining the access of an affordable energy, gradually developing a fiscal strategy that allows the transition to happen in a sustainable and also realistic way, and investing in the future. The region is one of the most affected regions in the world in terms of climate events. We issued recently a study that showed that over the last 3 decades, the cost, economic, social, and humanitarian cost that the region is enduring because of climate events. We see in several countries, Sudan is one of those countries where you have flood and drought at the same time, and climate events are affecting output, social inclusion, and also sustainable future. Therefore, yes, we should reconcile issues that are maybe currently are antagonistic. We should look forward and have a bold strategy for climate, and we should also join forces. I'm happy to see that the COP this year was in the region, and next year will be also in the region in UAE. And this is an important moment for countries to articulate and develop their climate transition strategy.
Thank you, Dr. Azour. Dr. Elbadawi.
Yes, this is a very important question also, and I wanted to highlight an important dimension here in terms of the link between macroeconomic reforms, as Elena suggested, in terms of moving into more flexible exchange rate regimes and certainly unified exchange rate regime. The Economic Research Forum is conducting a major study on energy transition that hopefully will continue for at least 2 to 3 years. And we have 6 case studies as part of this. And the most interesting initial evidence or suggestion is that for the cases of Lebanon and Sudan, the economic reform or the de facto exchange rate unification and the reform in the energy subsidies have actually unleashed a significant demand for solar energy platforms by SMEs. in agriculture and in other sectors. And so this is a situation where actually broad-based macroeconomic reform could actually, especially on the exchange rate side and subsidies, could actually promote the cause of renewable energy and also create jobs and also enhance the adaptation to climate change and mitigation as well. So I think these are all tied together, and we were quite actually excited about the findings from Lebanon and Sudan that the macroeconomic reforms have actually had such an important impact on the demand for solar and renewable energy.
Thank you, Dr. Elbadawi. Dr. Yaiche.
So can't agree more with our dear panelists, Dr. Ibrahim and Dr. Jihad. My only comment here, what I can add is definitely these issues of climate change should be in the heart of the upcoming investment, clearly. But this should not be the only one. And as I mentioned earlier, there are some other big trends and big issues and challenges behind other trends, like the demographic shifts. It's coming. Also, likely the limit of the current financial system. It's there. Like the technological distribution. It's there and it's happening. And the social instability. It's there. It's happening. And all the others. So, and we should not focus only about the trends that are impacting the big decision makers, that they see and feel the climate change. The others are also happening, and there are some dangerous scenarios. And this is why we need to sit down all around the table and to think collectively and to change the scale of the impact. And I saw what was done, for example, by the IMF, the 20 billion in financing, the 49 billion in boost of reserves. The World Bank also did a lot, etc. But I think what is needed is 10x or 100x if we combine all these challenges together, along with an innovative way of addressing issues and out-of-the-box thinking. So bigger picture, bigger scale together, not opposing, collectively come up with really innovative solution. And actually the ultimate goal is to build together a new system with togetherness.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Ribakova, insights on climate change and its impact, given the current crisis.
Maybe I'll just contribute very quickly on the financing side, because the IMF, of course, is busy coordinating on that front, especially at the time when we have limited global liquidity. We'll have to live for a long period of limited global liquidity. It's important to understand that a lot of financial institutions, asset managers, asset owners do have money allocated for ESG agenda. That is definitely squarely on the agenda of the financial industry. And it's important to tap into those pockets. And I've seen numerous meetings where we ask, especially emerging and frontier market issues, but are you planning to do any ESG related bonds? They're much more willing to finance because they have sort of a pockets of specifically allocated money for that. Of course, the next step is to have where multilateral institutions and also IMF can contribute is to have a more standardized sort of way we look at ESG, because each country might have very different ESG, while for an investor it's important to understand how they can compare one country to another, and also how they can demonstrate to their institutional asset holders that, look, we're indeed allocating the money the way that you mandated us to ESG. And for that, I think global standards are very important. And then finally, we shouldn't be too hypercritical about it. The biggest contributors to climate change over the last 100 years have not been emerging and frontier markets, but at the same time, we're demanding from them some absolutely new standards to which industrialized, sort of more recently industrialized economies have come today, now, after they have done all the pollution, right? So therefore, we need to understand for emerging frontier economies, for some of them, commodity exports are one of the key important, ways to earn revenues in order to be able to rebuild the economy. So we do need to look at that differently and not have this sort of too of an idealized standards that is the same for all. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. And with that, we come to the end of a very rich discussion regarding a very timely topic that is affecting every one of us in our daily lives and in our economies. I want to extend again my deepest gratitude to my distinguished panelists, Dr. Bakova, Dr. Yaiche, Dr. Elbadawi, and Dr. Azour. Thank you so much for taking the time. And I also want to extend my thanks for the colleagues in the back office who managed to, virtual office, who managed to have this webinar smoothly running. Thank you so much. Thank you again for all the attendees for your time. And we'll see you again in upcoming collaborations between the AUC, the IMF, and the ERF. Thank you.
Thank you.